to the Talent Optimization Podcast, the go-to podcast for CEOs and HR professionals wanting to bridge the gap between the strategy and tactical implementation of talent optimization within their organizations. Through interviews, predictive index, and personal experience, your host, Tracy Shirk, helps you discover the facets of talent optimization from both a CEO and HR perspective to truly create the dream team for your organization. Are you ready? Let's get started.
Welcome to the Talent Optimization Podcast. We have a special treat today as we talk about reflecting on the previous year and looking at what we want to do going forward into the next year. And it's a topic we really haven't broached yet in our conversations on the Talent Optimization Podcast. But how do we optimize our veterans that are reintegrating into the workforce? And that is what we're going to talk about during our conversation today, very specifically about we talk so much about how do we create an environment and a container for individuals to be fulfilled in their work. But so often what we miss is what's on that other person's plate that we don't know about, and how can we support them so that they're fulfilled in their work and we're meeting our business outcomes. So with me today is William Toti, and William is coming to us as a retired Navy captain, former CEO of Sparton Corporation, and really doing this work of serving organizations and veterans in the reintegration. So welcome.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we're recording this in November. So even though this won't go live until December, and my cousin Jake served 2 tours, and I'm saying this wrong, I am sure, in Iraq. And one of the things that came up on Veterans Day is there was a post that his employer Walgreens shared, and his comment on it was, "Happy almost Veterans Day to all who served. Thank you to all who support veterans, especially during reintegration to civilian society. Be a pal, help a vet. You won't regret it." And as I read that, I'm going, I never thought about the reintegration. And, Bill, that's when you and I were starting to have the conversation about this podcast. So tell me more about that process, what that looks like, why it fails, when it's great, all the things.
Well, when somebody decides that it's time to leave the military is actually obligated by law to give them what we've referred to as transition training. Now, sometimes that results in a bit of an apprenticeship called skills bridge. But the problem is, whatever side of this issue you fall on, good government, bad government, the government is required to do something. It's not required to do it well. And so they have their own agenda when they give this transition training. And much of the government's agenda does not serve the company well, that the veteran becomes an employee at. So, for example, the government would love the veterans to feel really good about their military service when they leave the service and about all these skills they developed while they were on active duty. So a lot of the transition training focuses on those things. And when they do that, sadly, it actually is counterproductive because it keeps reinforcing, in many cases, the wrong lessons that the veterans learned on active duty. An example of that, as I like to tell my active duty friends, leadership is hard, but it's even harder when you're leading people who can actually quit. And it's like, when I say that, a light bulb comes on because I served 26 years on active duty. And, I had some pretty challenging leadership situations I found myself in on active duty. But in final analysis, I was captain of a submarine. If my crew disagreed with me, there was no place for them to go. So when you tell an active duty guy, hey, all those leadership skills you learned and developed on active duty, they're going to serve you really well in industry. Turns out, maybe not so much. And maybe that's exactly the wrong message that you ought to be telling these transitioning veterans. And maybe the message needs to be something like, hey, you need to learn how to lead differently. And over the course of my 15 years in industry, including my tour as CEO of Sparton, that followed my 26 years on active duty, I hired hundreds of veterans. And I saw way too many of them fail. And it took a while for me to figure out that these problems that were causing the veterans to fail were structural, that they were being caused in many cases by the very service that they were being discharged from. And so I decided to write a book to help the veterans and to help companies that hire veterans improve the transition and assimilation and success rate. Because I know companies are very proud, like Walgreens, like your cousin, very proud to hire veterans. But when I ask any given company, how many of those veterans are still with you after 5 years? Most of those companies have no idea. And I'm willing to bet it's a very low percentage. And that's what we need to fix. Because these veterans, if they're trained properly, are going to be some of your best employees. But they don't come straight out of the military knowing how to do that.
So what's the magic answer?
Well, the magic answer is for the companies to understand the strengths and weaknesses that veteran is going to bring to the company, leverage the strengths, and figure out how to overcome the weaknesses by veteran transition training once they get hired, by skills development, and by assimilation, by creating veterans employee resource groups, and not assuming that the veteran's going to come to you ready to go. Throw them in the deep end, and they're going to figure out how to swim. Because too often, the transition is difficult enough as it is if they have the skills that they need to succeed in industry. Because there's a different culture, different climate, different work environment. How do I even deal with my colleagues? I've never had to do this before. There's so much of that transition culturally that's going to cause stress for the veteran. And that's if they come with the skills they need. But sadly, I'd say 80 to 90% of the veterans you hire are not going to come with the skills they need or are going to come with other baggage that the company needs to understand.
So what are the skills that 90%, 80 to 90% of the veterans don't come with that you can create a container or a training program or a buddy system around to ensure that there is that ramp up period for that?
If I would characterize the weakness in one simple sentence, it would be they're going to come to you thinking they know more than they actually do.
So like any employee, kind of, sort of, without that, because they've also lost the years in the workforce that other individuals have had. So if they've been in the service 8 or 10 years, they've lost that 8 to 10 years of experience in a normal workforce, normal quotes.
That's exactly right. Now, my book's title is From CEO to CEO, a practical guide for transitioning from military to industry leadership with the focus on leadership. So this applies to rank and file, I call it blue collar workers, all the lessons in my book. But the executives, or the ones who think of themselves as executives, mostly officers that are leaving the military, are going to be led to believe that they understand what profit and loss is. They're going to be told, and this is one of those giggle factors rise when you hear things like this, they're going to be told that not to describe themselves as commanding officer of this infantry battalion, but as chief executive officer of this infantry battalion. And they're going to be too naive to understand there's a very profound difference between a CO and a CEO. And they're going to assume they know more about leading in those situations than they really do. And so, again, properly trained and properly transitioned, these are going to be some of your best employees, but they're not going to be able to step into the role and succeed on day one.
Right. So part of what I hear you saying, and I'm going to equate this right or wrong, so correct this, but a lot of what I hear you saying is almost, we've got diversity, equity, and inclusion programs for so many different things. And I heard you talk about employee resource groups or ERGs earlier. And what I'm hearing you say is ensuring that you're applying not exactly a DE&I factor, but something similar to this in ensuring that we're paying attention to the differences coming in, but also that we're not paying too much attention to it where they become an outcast or an outsider. And I think, your book talks so much about, hey, best thing you can do is not thank a veteran for his service. And I was like, what?
Yeah. Don't say thank you for your service. Don't do anything that's going to draw a line between them and the rest of your rank and file employees. Now, I'm not saying no Americans should say that. I'm happy people are saying that. But what I'm saying is, as an employer, when you say that, it almost puts them on a pedestal. One of the things I found over the course of my industry career is that a lot of leaders in industry who have never served are afraid to treat their veterans the same as everybody else. So when the veteran is screwing up, they're afraid to have that challenging conversation with the veteran to tell them how they're screwing up and why they're screwing up. If the veteran is not exhibiting the right leadership skills, and that veteran had been, and again, I'm going to use my battalion commander example, on active duty, the never served manager has a hard time thinking to himself or herself, holy cow, how am I going to lecture this former battalion commander that they need to up their game in leadership? And rather than having that conversation with them, we let them fail. And this happens way too often. And you're exactly right on your D&I point. As you know, as HR people know, you will be reporting the number of veterans that you have employed in your company, right? It's just one of those factoids that the government likes you to be aware of. And yet, I would argue that that's the one bit of data that then results in no action on the part of the company. It's a bit of data that you track, but unlike other diverse groups that you may be tracking, most companies do absolutely nothing with that data other than report it to the government. They don't say, okay, what do we have to account for? As you properly point out, that veteran has lost years. While they were serving, their peers might have got an MBA, entered the workforce, done really good things, and started climbing the corporate ladder. The veteran, as they enter the workforce, is going to have none of those benefits. And yet they're going to see these other people that are around them that are entering the workforce that are, substantially younger. Not that that's a problem, right? But they're going to see themselves as having a long way to go to catch up. And that's going to create stress as well. So all of these factors are stressors that are going to add to the stress that just comes with the fact that they're leaving the military. And companies can really do a lot of good to help these things, but they have to first know about it.
Mm-hmm. So one of the other things, and I'm going to bring up a topic that I think so often doesn't get talked about, and I will first and foremost say, I don't know exactly how to talk about this, so I'm going to allow you to take this once I lob the question, okay?
Sure.
And what I want to kind of also share with our listeners is you have to have the conversations that you don't know the answers to, because it's the only way that you're going to bring it out from under the rug, right?
That's right.
And that is PTSD, right? So there's so often where, and I can tell you, I've been in so many situations inside of organizations or consulting with organizations where a question comes up around a veteran and say, hey, we've had situations in the past where someone's come in, we didn't know it, they had PTSD, now we have all these issues and we have safety issues in our organization and on and on. And yes, we can send them to EAP, but then they're gun shy to bring, and right or wrong word of saying that, right? But then there's some concerns about bringing individuals in and, hey, what is this? You named earlier, there's baggage that comes with hiring veterans. So how would you A, approach that? And then B, what can organizations do to do an and both of really supporting their veterans and coming in, and also really creating that inclusive environment inside of the organization?
Yeah, I regret to some extent the focus that's been placed on the PTSD issue. That's going to sound weird because I regret it because a tiny minority of veterans will suffer from PTSD, and a small minority of veterans who have had any combat service at all. And that's something that a lot of corporate executives don't understand. So the probability that you're going to hire a veteran that has issues with PTSD is actually quite small. Now, combat's not the only source of PTSD, of course, right? Sometimes women have been treated improperly and that causes PTSD. It's something that people don't think about. I was in the Pentagon on 9/11 and I suffered for a couple of years with some issues, not adjustment issues, but with some gloomy thoughts, I will characterize it. They never manifested in PTSD, but things that I had to still deal with when my friends died. So I don't want to characterize it as combat being the only cause. However, what I'm saying is that it's still a small minority of veterans that are going to suffer. So I regret it from that standpoint because it does cause some companies to be gun shy about hiring veterans because they think they're going to have to deal with this. And I'm thinking, actually less than 5% that you have to worry about. The other aspect that I'm sorry about is those 5% often don't get the attention that they need. And so I regret on both sides that companies are gun shy because they think this is going to be a major problem when it's not. It's going to be a tiny minority of veteran employees dealing with it. But those that are dealing with it do benefit from programs like EAP. And so, yes, it's important for companies to understand. I wouldn't broach the issue unless you see adjustment or behavior problems that cause you to believe it's an issue. And then, of course, get them the help they need, do what you can. But it does, for that tiny percentage of people that are suffering from these problems, it does add to the extreme stress that those veterans are suffering from already before they join your company. And of course, we always talk about the suicide rate and what impact PTSD has on veteran suicide. And there's absolutely a direct tie. And that's why it's great once you understand that there's an individual has a certain problem to get the right kind of professional help for those employees. Because again, once they go through it, they're going to be one of your best employees once they learn to deal with it. Mm-hmm. And so I really encourage companies to take a chance on the veterans, because in 95% of the case, you're going to find absolutely no issue whatsoever. And in the 5% of case where you might, they're going to respond very well to the same kind of programs that the company already has in place to deal with any challenging situation, whether it's a death in the family or, a child with special needs or anything like that.
So one of the things I'm hearing you say is don't otherize veterans that are coming in. Pay attention to what's going on, ask the questions, get to know them, just as you would anyone else, yet pay attention to here's some of the things that will be different. Mm-hmm. And if you have a program or something you can put in place that is no different than you would do for anyone else, publicly, privately have the conversation, guess what? You're going to be on that track to ensuring that reintegration process for them and with them is serving them and serving you as an organization.
Absolutely. I point out as we sit here today, there are 100 new members of Congress who are veterans from this election that was just concluded. And some of them are just absolutely eye-wateringly good, including a lot of female members of Congress who are veterans, right? And so as I talk about veteran transition programs, I remind people an increasing percentage of transitioning veterans are going to be female. And so all of these programs that I talk about to improve veteran transition apply equally well, regardless of gender. And boy, I'm telling you, some of these members of Congress that are coming in, their resumes are so incredible. It's hard to believe, how good they're going to be. And they're going to be just as good for your company. There are going to be some differences. That's the only point I'm making. It's not a one-size-fits-all practice. I hired thousands of employees, hundreds of which were veterans. And the same onboarding process that worked for the MBA straight out of graduate school, or, the engineer, straight out of Purdue University, or the veteran, they're not all the same. If you think that you can use the same program for those three very different demographics, then it's not going to work.
We find that with, you and I are not created the same. You've got different behavioral traits than I do. Guess what? You're going to need to be led a different way than I will based on what my strengths are. And I don't think that that's any different, but it's knowing the individuals that you're hiring, that you're bringing in, that you're paying attention to the culture, to the background, to the story, and to those strengths so that you can amplify it.
Yep. One of the things I tell veterans that are transitioning when I counsel them on, for example, preparing their resume, they get all kinds of advice from the wrong people. So they get advice from other veterans who transition, but many of the veterans they seek advice from haven't been successful. Like I joke, you've got the veteran who transitioned to a job and 30 years later, they're in the same job. Maybe you shouldn't take advice from that veteran. You got the veteran who's jumped around every 2 years. Because, as soon as they figure out, holy cow, I don't like this new company, maybe you shouldn't take advice from that vendor. And you've got the headhunters who just want to place people. And if the resume looks right, they're going to put them in and then, basically forget about them. And, you don't want to take advice from those people either. What I tell veterans, when you get down to the nuts and bolts of what the hiring company wants to see, evidence of, not hand-waving statements, but evidence of on your resume, is something I call an informed passion to learn. And informed because the veteran should not forget all this great global insight they've gained during their active duty time or whatever the specialty was, right? Don't dump that knowledge, leverage it and use it as you move forward, whether it's leadership or other skills. Passion, because every company wants fire in the belly. And, there's this saying in the military is embrace the suck. This sucks, but I'm going to embrace the suck. And, when you had to put up with austere environments and really bad conditions, I tell veterans, there's almost nothing that company can do to you that's going to be as bad as what you've already gone through. And so from the company's standpoint, that's a wonderful attribute for that veteran to be bringing, is that kind of passion that gets them through really hard times. And then to learn. Most veterans transfer and change jobs every 2 to 3 years. And this is one of those things that I talk to companies about. You've got to get the veteran through that, what I call PCS itch, where after 2 to 3 years, they're going to be thinking, isn't it time for me to change jobs right now? And they got to get through that, right? They got to power through that, put their head down and burn through that.
Right.
But to learn, what is the veteran going to have to do when they join their new company? They're going to have to learn what their job is. Well, they've been doing that every 2 to 3 years. Their entire time on active duty is learning a new job. And again, that's a wonderful attribute. But most veterans aren't counseled that these are good things to provide evidence of in their resume. Inform, passion to learn. And so that's why I pound that table with the veteran and say, are you informed? Do you have passion? And what evidence can you provide to your new employer of that passion?
Right.
And are you going to be able to learn this new job? What evidence can you provide that you're able to do that? And it causes them pretty much to throw out the resume that they had been working on based on, again, when I started this conversation with you, Tracy, and I say, they're going to be told all kinds of things by the military, and it's almost all going to be wrong. And they're going to cause them to throw it all out and start creating a resume that maybe, hopefully, makes sense to the hiring manager and the HR folks that are looking at these resumes that are going to be bringing them on board.
Right. You know, one of the other things that I would add, because I know we have some veteran listeners, and I know based on your base, there's going to be a lot of veterans listening to this too. But the other side of this is for veterans to take a really close look at what is the culture that they are walking into. You know, as human resources professionals and as hiring managers, we're really looking for 3 key things. Are you a behavioral match for the job? If the job is super detailed, are you naturally super detailed? That's an example.
Right.
The third piece, and I'll go to the second. The third piece is, hey, do you have the skill set to do the job, and or can you learn it? Which is really what you just talked about. But that second piece is culture. Right. And that culture is where normal everyday folks fail is, you know, and I've got my own story of I had the perfect job. Everything was great. It was with an organization that was, you know, I had to have 7 approvals before I could send a proposal out. I'm a very fast paced, fly by the seat of my pants person. I'm like, what? and part of my salary is based on commission of what I sell. What? No way, right? Yeah. So that was a culture mismatch. Amazing organization. The process worked for them and needed to based on who they were and what they needed. It didn't work for me. That was a culture mismatch, right? So with that being said, that culture that they're walking into is incredibly important that they vet that out in the interview process.
Absolutely. And there's so many other things like that that the employer can vet out in the interview process. And, you know, for example, veterans are going to be naturally inclined to follow a very Byzantine structured chain of command. And one of the best bits of advice I got within months of me leaving the Navy and joining my first company, which is, I'll say, was Raytheon, was you have to learn to live with ambiguity. And if you learn to unburden yourself of all this mandatory structure and figure out how to live with ambiguity, you might have a chance of succeeding in this civilian career. So that was kind of like epiphany number 1 for me. Epiphany number 2 is this bit about, oh, those leadership skills I used on active duty may not all be directly translatable. And this is where I learned the expression command and control leadership. Because in the military, command and control means something completely different. And I couldn't understand how command and control leadership could be a bad thing until I was asked to fire a retired 1-star general who was an employee of ours. And so, why am I firing him? Because he's a command and control leader. I'm not sure I understand what you're saying. That's a trait the company can look for. The other thing that I was really, really pumped up about was this bit about, what do you mean I don't have to wait for my turn to get promoted? You know, in the military, you know, it's 3 to 5 years. You got to wait for your turn to come. And you're no way you're getting promoted. And when I found out I could get promoted 6 months after I joined the company, holy cow, really? It was wonderful. And, you know, don't hold me back. It was my attitude. And happily, you know, I was a vice president 2 years and I was a president 5 years. And that's a wonderful thing to energize that veteran because they're not going to come to the company knowing this stuff. Right. And those are the kinds of things you can make sure they understand. Hey, look, you're going to get out of this what you put into it. Right. And the last thing is 2 books I recommend every transitioning veteran, any employer who hires transitioning veterans. My book, From CEO to CEO, Practical Guide for Transitioning from Military Industry Leadership, and the book titled, in which I'm pretty sure you're familiar with, What Got You Here Won't Get You There.
Yep. That's
right?
a great book.
It's a great book because what I tell veterans is the more you succeeded on active duty, the more likely you're going to be to fail in industry, because you're going to assume that the skills that allowed you to succeed on active duty are the same skills that will allow you to succeed in industry. And it's absolutely not true. Now, you can leverage those skills, but you're going to have to modify them heavily. And if you don't understand that, then you're going to have a hard time. So that is absolutely true.
Awesome. So as we start to close out, what would a takeaway be for an executive listening into our conversation today?
The veteran employee is going to be one of your best employees if you train them well, but you've got to put a little bit. I'm not talking about major investment. I'm not talking about putting them through a mini MBA or anything like that. But there are things that they're not going to come to you knowing. And these may be things that somebody straight out of high school or college will figure out within 6 months of joining your company. And here's this veteran who's been 10 years in, quote, the workforce, unquote, the military workforce. They're not going to know these things. So a little bit of honing and fine tuning will go a long way towards creating this great cadre of employees. And if you don't do that, there's a possibility that your investment in hiring that veteran will be wasted. So it's in your business best interest, number one, to hire really good veterans, and number two, spend a little bit of time and training it's going to take to make their transition smooth.
Right. And what's the takeaway for our HR professionals listening in today?
That it's just another diversity and inclusion challenge, a different kind. It's actually less stressing than some, because the veterans come to you with mostly fully formed skills that just require some modification. It's not like they're coming to you from a disenfranchised or, a population where you've got to kind of bring them up to speed more aggressively. But it's not going to require no tweaking. It's going to require some.
And I do not know any employee that has come into any organization that doesn't need some sort of tweaking.
Absolutely. Right? When I joined the company as a CEO, I needed some tweaking, right? It's always true. Yes.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being with us. And our listeners can find you on your website, which will be in the show notes, along with a link to your book as well.
Thank you very much, Tracy.
Yeah. And thank you so much for listening in today. And of course, we have our HR office hours that is available every Monday at 1:00. So if you are looking for that support for these tricky issues that you have coming through your organization, or just that HR best friend for you to have somebody to talk to and say, what do I do with this one? Please join our HR office hours, and we would love to chat with you about that. And with that, have a fantastic rest of your week. Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Talent Optimization Podcast. You'll find more tools and resources for CEOs and HR professionals looking to bridge the strategies versus implementation gap of talent optimization at elevatedtalentconsulting.com. We've also created a free, valuable resource for you to begin bridging the gap called the Talent Optimization Foundation Membership Program. You can access it for free at elevatedtalentconsulting.com/foundation. Be sure to tune in next week for another episode to learn more about talent optimization and creating a dream team for your organization.